space. They are tilted on their side because I'm an author, and if you have to tilt your head to follow along, that is fine. I'm not going to judge out loud. On the right, that orange is, the lighter color of orange is population density, and it's roughly the population density of Kansas if you melon scoop out Topeka and Kansas City. So you do know your neighbors. You've probably lost track of their day-to-day lives. If you go to the left, you are now looking at an economic and climate map. And that green V in the middle that roughly overlaps where the people live, that's the Russian wheat belt. And in economic terms, of the world's major agricultural zones, that is the least productive spot on the planet. You can grow one crop of short season wheat per year, and that's it. In the summer, the climate is about like western Kansas, and in the winter, it is roughly like northeastern Alberta. So hot and dry, or cold, dry, windy. The income that comes from that one crop of wheat is so low per acre that the Russians, even today, have never been able to successfully build a road network. Ugh. You want to move anything of volume in the Russian system, you have to do it by rail. Now, if you move it to the left, if you go to the yellow to the south, that's desert, completely empty. If you go to the right to the blue, you're now in tundra and taiga, also empty. But what really drives the Russians to drink is the beige. Territories that are completely empty and by Russian definition, totally useless, but totally flat. And you can totally get a Mongol horde through that. Russia's been invaded 50-odd times in its history. And never once, when the foe has made it to the green, made it to the good land, have the Russians ever ejected them. It's been the weather that's done the heavy lifting. So the Russian strategy since the beginning has always been the same. Expand out of the green through the beige, and you get to those red markers, those geographic barriers that you can't shove a panzer division through. And then you forward position your very, very slow-moving rail-supplied troops in those blue access points that are between those barriers. The Soviet system was the height of Russian security. They controlled all of those access points, and then they lost them all. Post-Soviet Russia, especially under Putin, has spent every waking moment trying to rebuild that outer shell. And in the 23 years that Putin has been in charge, he has launched now 8 military conflicts with that in mind, to rebuild those footprints. This is the Georgia War, this is the Crimea War, the Donbass War, the Kazakh intervention, the Karabakh War. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it's not that Ukraine controls these access points, but it's on the way to the 2 most important ones. And as long as that is the case, Russia will not stop until it has all of Ukraine, and then it will continue beyond Ukraine. We're only midway through this story. Now, you guys remember back in the first week of the war when we thought this was going to all be over really quickly? How on the 4th day, we had that 40-mile-long convoy of vehicles going from Belarus south towards Kiev. It was like, crap, this is it. And then on the 4th day of the war, the convoy stopped because they forgot fuel. And then on the 7th day of the war, all the soldiers dismounted from their equipment and walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. And everyone I know at every defense ministry across NATO thought the same thing. Well, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a modern war at all. They've forgotten all of the lessons they've learned in the last 200 years. It's a parade force. They're doing worse than the Iraqis did in 1992. If we go head to head with Russia, there will be 1,000-to-1 casualty ratios. It will be a wipeout. And this made no one happy at all, because the Russians see this war accurately as an existential battle for their survival. They know if they fail at this, they are completely exposed to whatever's next, and their demographic situation is so horrible. This is the last generation that they have soldiers to fight. So if we do have a direct confrontation with NATO, they will use every tool they have, and there will be a general nuclear exchange. So the decision was made very, very early in Washington and London and Berlin and the rest that we have to destroy the Russian military capacity to function here, now, in Ukraine, but without a single set of NATO boots on the ground. And so any equipment that the Ukrainians can prove that they can operate competently, that doesn't violate our security, they can have. And there's right now 60,000 Ukrainian troops training across NATO countries right now. They will all be back in theater by May when the spring offensive begins. That was our lesson. The Russians had their own lesson. They're like, okay, maybe we drank a bit too much of our own Kool-Aid. Maybe these are not Jewish Nazi gay demons, and maybe they're just people who are fighting for their home. And if that's the case, if they're going to fight for their home, then the civilian population is no longer a non-issue, it's a problem. Well, we can reach into our own history and find a strategy for that. We could advance very, very slowly behind a never-ending hail of artillery fire, not targeting anything that moves, targeting anything that stands. Because if we can obliterate every scrap of civilian infrastructure, then Ukraine cannot support an industrial level population. And the population will self-segregate into two groups. Group number one will run. We never have to worry about them again. Group number two, if they stay behind and they're under age 55, they clearly stay to fight and we can shoot them on sight. Getting good data out of a war zone is always hard, especially when one side is pathologically lying about any data that there might be. We don't know how many people have been killed, how many civilians have been killed. The estimates I've seen are somewhere probably between 100 and 300,000. That's approximately the same pace in the first year of the Holocaust during World War II. This war, like everything with the Russians, is ultimately about scale. You can see that Texas is up there to give you an idea of scale. The Russians are trying to build a defensive perimeter on a border that's 3 times the length of ours with half the population. And they're trying to do it with numbers. Okay. What we're looking at here is a map of the conflict zone. Now, those dotted lines are those all-important rail lines. The deep red are the territories that the Russians controlled at the end of the last war. Remember, this is the 8th time that the Russians have launched a military attack since 1999. The really fun part starts right here. This is the Kherson pocket. This is the only chunk of territory that was west of the Dnieper River, that's kind of like their Mississippi, that the Russians were able to capture early in the war. And starting in about July, the Ukrainians advertised publicly that that's where they were going first. This is the chunk of territory they wanted to liberate first. The Russians saw those advertisements, and so they moved about 25,000 of their best forces to the other side of the river to reinforce. Best equipment they have. On November 1, that assault did begin, but as we all know, that wasn't the whole story. There was also a second assault right here because the Russians had to move their troops from somewhere, and the Ukrainians waited to see where they were being pulled from. And in that assault, the entirety of Kharkiv province fell within 5 days. Even better than that, this little dingleberry right here, you guys see that? That is Izium. That was the Russians' forward logistical base. It's a rail hub. They were planning on launching multiple assaults from that next spring to basically capture a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory. It fell in 36 hours, intact. And in 36 hours, the Ukrainians captured more gear, more tanks, more artillery, more shells, more gasoline from the Russians than they started the war with. More than we had transferred to Ukraine in 7 months. Big win. And then they went on to capture Kherson as well and got about half as much, again, equipment. So the Ukrainians at the moment are going through 6 months of deferred maintenance on a lot of Russian gear with the hope of getting it all into working order by the time we get to May. Which means that now we're in a bit of a different kind of conflict. Things are kind of stalled because the weather has been weird. Normally at this time in the year, everything would be frozen solid and you'd have tanks running around everywhere. But it's abnormally warm throughout Europe, including in Ukraine. It's about 40 degrees in Kiev today, which means everything's really muddy. And we're not talking like Louisiana mud here. You know, you can like have a fan boat and go over that crap. We're talking about like deep churning clay-based mud.